Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Action Podcast, where we talk about all things movies. Today, we step into the world of toys and go to infinity and beyond to talk about the making of the world's first fully computer animated film, Toy Story. Coming out in November of 1996, Toy Story was directed by John Lasseter. The original story was written by John Lasseter, Pete Docter, Andrew Stanton, and John Ramft. The screenplay was written by Joss Whedon, Andrew Stanton, Joel Cohen, and Alex Sokolow. Producers were Bonnie Arnold and Ralph Guggenheim, with executive producers Ed Catmull and Steve Jobs. Toy Story was the world's first fully computer animated film. Before we begin, I'm going to give you a quick summary of the film Toy Story. Our story begins with our favorite sheriff, Sheriff Woody, a cowboy doll who belongs to a young boy named Andy. Now, Woody is Andy's favorite toy up until he is gifted a new toy from his parents for his birthday. This toy is a Space Ranger action figure by the name of Buzz Lightyear. Now, Buzz and Woody don't get along very well, and Woody ends up pushing Buzz out a window when Woody finds out that Andy wants to take Buzz to Pizza Planet instead of him. So Woody ends up going with Andy to Pizza Planet, but Buzz finds his way into the car. While they're at Pizza Planet, Woody and Buzz get into a fight and they get left behind, and then they end up in one of those claw machines, where they are then picked up by Andy's estranged neighbor, Sid Phillips. Now, in order to escape the clutches of Andy's neighbor Sid, Woody and Buzz must get past their differences to find their way home before Andy and his family move away. Now let's get into how it started. Ed Catmull had a dream of doing a fully computer animated feature film, and this quickly became the dream of John Lasseter too. Now, before Toy Story, they had only accomplished computer animated shorts. In February of 1986, Steve Jobs bought Lucasfilm Computer Division from Lucasfilm and developed a second company, Pixar. Excitement was found around computer graphics when Pixar first started up. Nobody knew what they were doing, but the Pixar team was set on figuring it out. Jobs wanted the team to continue doing computer animation with an eye towards doing a computer animated feature film. That was always their goal. In 1988, Pixar made a short film titled Tin Toy. Tin Toy won Pixar their first Oscar, and it was also the first computer animation to receive an Oscar. Tin Toy was the first film anyone on the Pixar team had any creative control over. Pixar and the team had to develop the tech for computer animation, and they created the tools in the animation medium needed to make their fully computer animated film. Lasseter and the team developed a new animation and rendering system seen in Tin Toy. So, minus the live-action layout, the steps to make Toy Story included storyboard, layout, and final. The storyboard process had every single shot laid out in it, and I watched a documentary that looked like the storyboard covered all of the walls in a conference room, and Toy Story was in storyboard for 3 years. They storyboarded it and re-storyboarded it for 3 years. And in 1991, Pixar was thinking of making a Christmas special with Tinny, our character from the Tin Toy short. It was a good next step to doing long-form animation, and they pitched the ideas to all of the studios because their goal was to make a feature film computer animation. Peter Schneider, who was head of Disney Animation Studios at the time, called Pixar and said Disney was interested in Pixar doing an animated feature film for them. Ed Catmull thought on it and agreed to do it. I mean, it gave them a shot, so they went for it. The team was very excited for this opportunity. Now, were they scared? Not at all. The task ahead was large and daunting, but the team was ready to take it on. And when they were figuring out what to do, they had to think about what was easy to do at the time. And the idea of toys was visited often, because everything they made, whether intentional or not, looked like plastic. And a movie about toys embraced the limitations of the technology at the time. Now, Joss Whedon had never been interviewed for Pixar. He was just sent there by Disney. And when he got there, it was early in the process and there was no cast yet. Now, with that, let's move into casting. Tom Hanks was cast as the voice of Woody. He was the first and only one John Lasseter thought of when thinking of a voice actor for Woody. They took lines from Turner and Hooch, a Tom Hanks film, and animated them with Woody. They then showed it to Hanks, and he was sold on the project. Tim Allen was the voice of Buzz Lightyear. Lasseter loved his stand-up routine, and Allen was always interested in voice acting, so he was recruited. Next, we have Don Rickles as Mr. Potato Head, Jim Varney as Slinky Dog, Wallace Shawn as Rex, John Ratzenberg as Ham, Annie Potts as Bo Peep, John Morris as Andy, Eric Von Detten as Sid, Laurie Metcalf as Mrs. Davis, R. Lee Ermey as Sergeant, Sarah Rain, known as Sarah Freeman, as Hannah, Penn Jillette as the TV announcer, Jack Angel as Shark/Rocky Gibraltar, Spencer Ast as the Wounded Soldier, Greg Berg as local announcer, Debbie Derryberry, now that is a fun name, you guys, as the Aliens and Pizza Planet announcer, Bill Farmer as the monotone announcer, Craig Good as Mission Control, Daniel Judovitz as Burned Ragdoll, Sherry Lynn as Mom, Mickey McGowan as Sid's mom, Jeff Pigeon as Aliens, Robot, and Mr. Spell, Patrick Pinney as Pizza Planet announcer and Pizza Planet guard, Jan Rabson as gas station attendant, Joe Ramft as Lenny the Binoculars, and Andrew Stanton as the commercial chorus. Now, I wasn't planning on including the entire cast, but the further down the list of the cast I went, the more I saw just the characters that we wanted to know spread out throughout the list, and instead of digging through the list, I decided to just keep the whole thing. Now, let's get into some ideas they had when they were brainstorming the idea of Toy Story. And when they were brainstorming what to do, they started with a list of what they didn't want the film to be. Now, they didn't want it to be a fairy tale or a musical, and they didn't want it to be any of the same kinds of things that Disney did. They wanted it to be different. They wanted to make something different. They wanted to make a different story, and what they landed on was a genre known as the buddy picture. Now, the buddy picture was a genre that had never been done in animation before, and the team took this genre and went back to their Tin Toy Christmas storyline. They had two characters, Tin Toy and a ventriloquist doll. The ventriloquist doll was the child's favorite toy. So the story went, the kid gets a tin toy for his birthday. And the story is how Tin Toy and the ventriloquist doll deal with it. The original idea before the new toy for Christmas was the Tin Toy is on family vacation and he gets left at a rest stop, then thrown in a truck with a ventriloquist doll. They stick together and eventually end up in toy heaven. It evolved to the Tin Toy and the ventriloquist doll. The Tin Toy gets gifted to the child for his birthday, and the Tin Toy and ventriloquist doll have to deal with the outcome of how that ended up. And as the idea developed, they realized a tin toy wasn't the most exciting, fun toy a child at the time could get. So the team got together and they designed their own toy with all of their favorite features from their favorite toys. Lasseter, while they were developing the idea of this toy, watched what his kids played with, and they played with action figures. So some of the features that this toy they ended up with were karate chop, laser, moving fingers, etc., etc. They took all of these features and they shoved them into one toy, and this toy became the character we know as Buzz Lightyear. Buzz Lightyear did not start as Buzz Lightyear, though. First, he was Lunar Larry, and after that, he was Tempest from Morph, and finally, he became Buzz Lightyear. His color scheme started with red, yellow, and silver, and then in the final product, he was green, white, and purple. Now back to our ventriloquist doll. Thanks to one Bud Lucky, the ventriloquist doll was changed to a cowboy we know and love as Sheriff Woody. It worked out well because in history, cowboys were replaced by spacemen. Kids began to migrate towards spaceman action figures over cowboy action figures. The character Woody had a selfless exterior but a selfish interior. The team wanted him flawed, but likable. They wanted to make a leader that everybody liked. They were going for a Jimmy Stewart type character. And Woody was based on Lasseter's toy doll Casper that he's had since he was little. It has a pull string like Woody and a voice box that makes the cowboy talk, and at the time I watched the documentary, he was 37 years old. The doll, not Lasseter. When they were creating the toy's personality, they looked at how their toys were made. Did they have cheap plastic, good plastic? What was the quality of their paint? Things like that. Those qualities made the characters and their personalities. Now, before animation begins, the voice actors would come in to record their lines. And in Alan's first recording session, they went in with the idea that Buzz was aware of the show and the show he was in. But then Alan played the character so real and honestly that they changed it after the first session to make it so Buzz didn't know he was a toy, but that he was a real space ranger. Rickles, who voiced Mr. Potato Head, thought that their recording sessions would be them sitting on the floor playing with toys and saying their lines. Now, wouldn't that be a fun recording session to be in? During recording, the actors wouldn't face the screen, they would face the producers and directors behind the glass in the other room. They would do the lines and noises over and over, and the crew on the other side of the glass would tell them whether it was good or if they had to redo it. Now that we've gone over a little bit of the character development, the cast, and some of the voice recording, let's get into what Pixar calls Black Friday. Black Friday was their first go at the film. Now, the first year they were working on the film, they would storyboard a sequence, then Tom Schumacher and Peter Schneider would go out to give them notes on how to make it better and what changes they should make. Then Pixar would make the changes, and they would go to Disney, pin up the boards, and get more notes and more changes, and the next morning, they'd pitch it to Jeffrey Katzenberg, who would push for more what he called edge. He wanted it to be more adult. Now, this edge made Woody very unlikable. They got the first half of the movie done on story reels and took it to Disney to show them, and Pixar wasn't happy with it, and they didn't even like it. And when they showed Disney, Disney didn't like it. The Pixar team was embarrassed. This movie that they had made was not their movie anymore. Disney then shut down production, and they wanted Pixar to lay people off, and Pixar refused. Disney wanted Pixar to make the film at their studio under their supervision, and Lasseter asked them to give them 2 weeks to turn it around on their own, and the Pixar team then worked day and night to fix it and make it their own movie once again. Joss Whedon, after Black Friday, was able to write exactly what they described to fix the script after the failed screening. And through this experience, the Pixar team learned that they need to trust their guts, to go with their instincts, and make the movies that they want to make something that they know they would be proud of. Now let's get into how they animated this movie. Early on, they did tests with Buzz and Woody, to test the models, the puppets, to see how they moved, and to figure out if they could use them for a whole feature film, and also to see what the character was all about, and how the personality they constructed for the character in storyboard gets expressed through movement. In short, they were trying to find the characters. They then made another test, a short scene with Woody and Buzz, who was Tempest at the time. They thought that because people were used to hand-drawn animation, an audience wouldn't sit through 70 minutes of computer animation. But as soon as the imagery was lit, textured, and rendered, Lasseter knew that no one had ever seen anything like it before. It felt like you could reach out and touch the toys, which is what they wanted to show Disney and everyone else. Once they showed it, there was no longer any doubt. The tech they had at the time was in its infancy because they were the ones developing and creating it. No one had ever done computer animation before. Well, in long form. No one had ever done a full feature animated film with computers before. Compared to what we have today, the technology they had back then is primitive. All the animators came from stop motion or hand-drawn animation backgrounds, and they all had to learn how to animate on the computers. People from computer backgrounds helped with animation as well. The animator and the computer tech would sit side by side, figuring out the animation and work together to make the movie. Lasseter would say that the art challenged the tech, and the tech inspired the art. I mean, the technology is how they ended up making a movie about toys. If they had much better technology, they probably wouldn't have made a story about toys, but who knows? The technology they had did make most things they animated look plasticky, so that's why they went with toys. Hence, it inspired the art. Sometimes they would add things to the story that were inspired by watching and seeing what the technical people were doing. So sometimes the animators would sit and they'd just watch what the computer techs were doing, and then later on they would add something new to the story. Now this is fun, and I really hope they still do fun stuff like this in the studios. I mean, they don't have to transfer it the same way, but I still hope they do fun stuff like this in the studios. To transfer a finished shot of animation, they would have to put it on a videotape, and then it would be taken to the editors by scooter through the hallways. And I really hope, I mean, granted we don't need to do this anymore, but I hope they have fun stuff like that still going on in the studios. Now, Ralph Eccleston and his staff designed all the sets in the film. They designed the neighborhood, the streets, the trees, the leaves on the trees, the houses, all of it. They designed all of it. They tried to remove the sets in the film from the computer look. They had lots of straight lines that they tried to soften by rounding corners here and there, and they used lots of specialized lighting. They wanted to make it look believable. So they wanted to make the sets look a little more realistic than the toys that they had. They didn't want the sets to look plasticky like the toys because we're stepping into the world of toys. And toys don't see everything as plastic. They are plastic. What they're seeing is our world just through their eyes. Traditionally trained artists and animators would collaborate with computer geniuses for this film, and everything you see in this computer animation has to be made from scratch. So everything in Toy Story, the animators and the computer technicians made themselves in the computer. The work they put into this to make computer animation easier and possible for us today is inspiring and absolutely amazing. They would start with blueprints that they called model packs, and these model packs would then be given to a modeler, and they would take these models and create it in the computer. And that's actually how Buzz's box was made. That's one of the things they made with these models. Organic shapes like Buzz's face were put into the computer from the surface of a clay model with a digitizer wand. So they would have this wand, it looked kind of like a pen, and then there was a grid on the face. In the documentary that I saw, they had these models, and on these models there was a grid, and they would use this digitizer pen to just scan the face, and it would put it right into the computer. This process would accurately capture the shape of the object by sampling points on the surface, and once they had enough points, they could then fit a mathematical surface through the points. They built the system that lets you build facial muscles in a simple form that still allowed them to do facial expressions that are part of character expression too. So the Pixar team pretty much created all the technology that you need to make a computer animation, and I'm just walking you through it. And that's why that's why I decided to talk about this movie, because of the steps that were taken to make this movie and the amount of development that was made in this time to make this movie. Without it, we truly wouldn't have we truly wouldn't be where we are today with computer animation. After they put the shapes and characters into the computer, they are then given to the animator to control and animate. The system they had was designed for the traditionally trained animators with zero computer experience to sit down and within a few weeks begin animating. Each joint and muscle had a control in the system associated with it to move it around as needed. At this point, the character looks like an armature, but in a computer. Now, if you remember when we talked about The Nightmare Before Christmas back in Season 1, we talked about armatures. That's how they make the clay figures in stop motion. They have these little metal figures that they then put the clay, they build the characters out of clay around, and those metal armatures inside allow them to move. Now, this is what I'm talking about right here. At this point in animation, the characters look a lot like those little metal armatures that they use in stop motion. The animators try to make the movement work and communicate without facial expressions, because if they can do that, then they've done a successful job, and when the facial expressions are added, they make it even better. Now, if you remember from earlier in this episode, I did say that they didn't have live action references, but later on in my research, I was corrected, and I do have a line here in my script that is correcting me in that, and they did occasionally use live-action references. One time they used the live-action reference, the Army Men. One thing they did to accurately represent the Army Men in Toy Story, they put a pair of shoes on a plank of wood and nailed them to the wood, and they would walk around in it and pretend to be the Army Men, and that's how they figured out the movement for the Army Men. Once the storyboard is done, we're going to skip over now to layout. Once the storyboard is done, the layout begins. And here is where they start in the computer and figure out which models and characters they need in the scene, where the camera is going to be, and whether that camera is going to be moving or not. Once they finish and are happy with that, it's given back to the animators to bring the characters together. They bring the image to life by adding lighting, shadows, textures, colors, and everything else that you need to make something believable. Everything seen on screen has to be defined in terms of color and texture. Once those are chosen, the painter takes them and caricatures them slightly. Then they work with a technical director to apply those paintings onto the objects, and that's what we see in the final film. The technical director also works with the painter on what aging is needed. Things like dirt on characters' clothes, are they shiny or matte, little things like that. They're animating what the object is supposed to feel like. Is it dirty? Is it clean? Is it bumpy or smooth? Things like that. To animate Sid's dog Scut, they referred to the Edward Muybridge book to help them get an accurate run for him. They also had an imperfectionist. An imperfectionist is an artist that goes in and adds scuff marks, paint chips, the usual wear and tear you see around a house. Because we're seeing the house from the point of view of the toys. So instead of seeing everything nice and clean, we're seeing those little things that we can't see with our own eyes. We're seeing the tiny scuff marks or the little paint chips, and we're seeing them the way the toys see them. There's one more thing I want to talk about while we're in animation, and it's the Pizza Planet. It doesn't have much to do with the animation, but when they were making the film, Pizza Planet actually started as Pizza Putt, and then in the final film, it ended up as Pizza Planet. And that's just a little fun fact I wanted to include in here. Now let's move on to score and soundtrack. The Pixar team didn't want the film to be a musical, like we said before. They didn't want songs for the characters to sing, but they still wanted fun songs in the movie. They wanted songs that would tell a story about what was happening during that time the song is playing during the film. So when Lasseter was thinking about who could do the songs for the movie the way they wanted, he said there was one name that came to mind for him, and that name was Randy Newman. When Lasseter contacted Newman about Toy Story, he told him that he thought the film would need warming up because it was a computer animated film. And most people at the time thought that computer animated films would be cold. They wouldn't have that emotion that live action films would have. But if you ask me, I think Toy Story did an amazing job with giving those toys real emotion and putting feelings into their eyes. And the music just enhanced that. The music just made it better than it would have been without music. Now, the first song that Newman was asked to write was a song they wanted to use at the start of the film to explain Woody and Andy's relationship. And then they wanted to use this song again to show Woody and Buzz's relationship by the end of the film. This song was, you guessed it, You've Got a Friend in Me. One of my favorite Disney Pixar songs. Newman said that recording with the orchestra for Toy Story were some of the best days of his life. He had a lot of fun making the songs, writing the songs, and recording the songs for this movie. Let's get into the sound. We've finished talking about the score. I couldn't find a ton on the score, but I did find some really interesting things, and I'm really pleased with what I did find because sometimes it's really hard to find information about the scores of movies, so I'm really happy with what I did find for the score and soundtrack of this film. Now, getting into sound, every toy in Toy Story has a signature sound because most of them are toys that people recognize. You know, like the Etch-a-Sketch, the Hot Wheels, Woody's pull string. They're all noises that people are familiar with because they're on toys that people are familiar with. The RC car, that's also a toy that people are familiar with. So they used realistic sounds because the toys looked real. So the audio needed to sound real. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't also use cartoony sounds. They did in some points use cartoony sounds. And they used real sounds when they needed it to be serious. So they used funny sounds when they wanted it to be funny, and serious sounds when they needed it to be serious or when they needed it to feel like an action movie. They used the sounds necessary to create the feeling that they needed during specific points in the film. And before we move on to the box office and the release of the movie and the conclusion of this episode, I do have a little bit about the editing of this film. When they were editing Toy Story, they tried not to cut anything out of the film because the animating of this film was time-consuming and expensive, and the animators all worked really hard on this film, and they were really happy and excited for this film, so they tried not to cut out a ton of scenes and sequences from the movie, but unfortunately, sometimes cuts need to happen, even in animation, when you worked really hard on a sequence. But lucky for them, only a few scenes were cut out. Unfortunately, I was unable to find any of the scenes that were cut out, and if I could find them, I would have described them to you, but I could find no evidence of any of these scenes. Now let's get into the box office and release of this film. Toy Story was in the works for 4 years. The whole team loved this movie, and they didn't care what anyone else thought of it. Though they did hope it would be well received because they wanted to be able to do it again. They finished the film in late fall, and it came out on Thanksgiving, which was November 22nd of 1996. The premiere took place at the El Capitan Theater in California. People loved it, and it became the #1 film. The domestic box office was $191,796,233. The international box office was $52,855,355. And together, they made the worldwide box office $244,651,588. Reviews about this movie only contained 1 or 2 lines about it being completely computer animated, and the rest of the review was about the movie itself. And that was something that made them very excited, because they didn't want people to just talk about the computer animation. They wanted people to talk about the movie that they had worked so hard to make. So the fact that they talked a little bit about it being computer animated and then they talked about the film was a really good thing. Now, this meant that they had succeeded not just with computer animation, but also as a studio. And with this big success, Pixar was able to do this again, and they are still around today. Thanks to Toy Story, we have amazing computer animation technology that makes 3D animation and 2D animation much more possible, and I would assume a little bit easier to make than it was in the 90s. Now, before we close out this video, I'm going to go over some of the wins and nominations that Toy Story has received at award shows. Starting with the Academy Awards, in 1996, Toy Story was nominated for Best Writing Screenplay Written Directly for the Screen. Randy Newman in 1996 was nominated for Best Music Original Song, as well as Best Music Original Music or Comedy Score. And in 1996, John Lasseter won a Special Achievement Award from the Academy Awards. Moving on to the BAFTA Awards, in 1997, it was nominated for Best Achievement within Special Visual Effects. And now on to the Golden Globes. In 1996, it was nominated for Best Motion Picture, Comedy or Musical, and Randy Newman was nominated for Best Original Song Motion Picture. And finally, one more that I would like to just give an honorable mention to is in 1996, Toy Story was nominated for the favorite movie at the Kids' Choice Awards in the United States. There are plenty more nominations and awards that this movie has been given. It has 29 wins and 23 nominations, but in order to save time, I'm not going to go over all of them, but you can find the rest of them on IMDb Toy Story Awards. Toy Story was the first fully computer animated film, and it resonates with adults and children alike. Toy Story was the start of Pixar. It truly got Pixar off the ground, and they wouldn't be where they are today if they hadn't pulled it off. Toy Story revolutionized animation and brought forth new software and technology for animated filmmaking. It paved the way for animated films today, and without it, who knows where animation would be. And with that, we close out this episode of Action Podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. Make sure you go follow Action on TikTok and Instagram at actionpodcast.cs. Also, go subscribe to Action on YouTube. You can find Action on YouTube at Action Podcast. I will be uploading videos every 1 to 2 weeks and uploading shorts at least once to twice a week. Same with Instagram and TikTok. I post shorts and posts on there as often as I can. You can find this podcast anywhere you listen to your podcasts: Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, literally anywhere you listen to your podcasts. And once again, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you all in the next episode.